Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets weird but the voice stays calm. Tonight we're exploring the story of a so-called miracle, a chemical that began as medicine and became a mirror for human suffering, heroin, a name once whispered with admiration in the corridors of modern science, now uttered with dread in the news. It was born in a laboratory filled with optimism, men in starched coats trying to improve on nature's own painkillers. It was sold as pure comfort, a cure for coughing, and even a gentle solution for those already dependent on morphine. And for a brief, shining moment, it really did look like humanity had bottled mercy. Of course, chemistry had other plans. Over the next century, this same substance would travel through battlefields, alleys, and legislatures, transforming from a pharmaceutical triumph into a global catastrophe. It would fund wars, destroy cities, and quietly expose the limits of law and morality. Yet in the end, after 100 years of fear and punishment, the lesson proved surprisingly soft. You cannot outlaw pain, but you can ease it, one life at a time. So before we begin, take a quiet moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the room settle around you. You might even hear the faint hum of your own breathing, steady and small, the same rhythm that every medicine, every addiction, and every recovery has tried to preserve. And when you're ready, let's wander gently into the long, strange story of the drug that wanted to be a hero. You begin with a flower, small, pale, and unassuming. Its petal hardly suggest a global empire. But beneath those petals hides a milky sap, thick as honey and twice as persuasive. That sap is opium, and humanity has been negotiating with it for more than 5,000 years. The Sumerians called it the plant of joy. To the Egyptians, it was a tool of balance, something to ease pain, calm spirits, and help the dying drift quietly into the next world. Greek physicians treated it like divine punctuation, the thing you reached for when life became too sharp. Even Hippocrates, the man famous for warning doctors to do no harm, kept a little jar of it nearby. It soothed, it silenced, it solved, or at least it pretended to. In the Roman world, opium travelled easily, tucked into amphora and medical kits. It was the first international commodity of comfort. People didn't yet have aspirin or antibiotics, or the faintest idea how nerves worked, but they knew pain, and they knew the poppy worked. It worked so well, in fact, that it became hard to imagine a world without it. Every civilization that touched it called it both a blessing and a trap. There's something quietly hypnotic about a substance that can erase both fever and grief. The ancients didn't call it addiction, they called it devotion. Priests brewed it into sleeping potions for rituals, soldiers chewed it before battle, and mourners swallowed it to soften the edges of loss. In clay tablets and hieroglyphs you can still find records of its doses, not measured in milligrams but in metaphors. A grain for sorrow, a drop for silence. The language itself was already halfway between science and prayer. By the time it reached medieval Europe, opium had been absorbed into nearly every form of medicine. It was called laudanum, a syrup of wine and powdered poppy resin. Physicians prescribed it for everything from toothaches to tuberculosis. Mothers gave it to crying infants, and it worked. Too well, in fact. Cough stopped, pain faded, and babies slept. For hours, sometimes forever. The pattern was always the same. Every generation believed it had found a safe way to use opium. Every generation discovered too late that the line between healing and dependence was invisible. And each time, people tried again, because the promise of comfort is stronger than memory. If you imagine the smell of it, heavy, sweet, and slightly rotten, you can almost understand the allure. It's a scent that feels medicinal, but ends in surrender. Farmers in ancient Thebes harvested it at dawn, scoring the green pod so the sap could bleed out slowly. They dried it in the sun, wrapped it in linen, and shipped it across deserts. By the time it reached a physician's table, it looked like dark amber, the colour of sleep made solid. It's easy from the safety of modern hindsight to see the danger, but for the ancients, opium wasn't moral or immoral. It was simply a gift from nature that worked better than anything else they had. In that way, it was honest. It never lied about what it could do, only people did. When chemistry finally appeared centuries later, it would look at this brown resin and decide it could be improved, refined, purified, made modern. The logic was noble. If the plant works, then its essence must be even better. But distilling mercy has a strange side effect. You lose the smell, the texture, and the warnings that nature built into it. You keep only the power, and power, once isolated, behaves like it's been waiting to be misused. So the story of HEROIN doesn't begin in a lab at all. It begins in a field, under sunlight, with a flower that taught humans how to quiet pain, and then forgot to teach them how to stop. What followed was inevitable. Someone would one day turn this sap into science, weigh it on glass scales and call it progress. The poppy would finally be domesticated, not by farmers, but by chemists, and that, as it turned out, was the real addiction, the belief that comfort could be perfected. You've reached the early 1800s, the moment when human curiosity finally becomes more dangerous than any poison. In a small dim room in Germany, a young apothecary named Friedrich Serturner sits awake among glass flasks and half-burned candles. The air smells of vinegar, metal, and ambition. He's been boiling down the sticky sap of the opium poppy, searching for the single ingredient that holds all its power. He doesn't yet know that he's about to isolate pain itself. Serturner extracts a pale, crystalline powder, the first alkaloid ever purified from a plant. He tastes it on the tip of his tongue, because that's what early scientists did when they didn't have ethics committees. His heart slows, his thoughts drift. When he wakes, he writes that the substance induces serene apathy. It is the essence of sleep, he says, given form. He names it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine. For the first time in human history, pain can be measured in milligrams. The idea feels divine, a substance that acts the same every time, no matter who you are. A physician can weigh compassion on a scale. A patient can trust the dose. No prayers, no guessing, just chemistry. The trouble, as always, hides in success. Morphine works so well that it teaches doctors to stop listening and start prescribing. The problem of pain begins to look solvable, a dangerous illusion. By the mid-1800s, morphine travels the world in glass vials. Pharmacists adore it. Hospitals treat it like a miracle in liquid form. Even the American Civil War turns into a kind of laboratory. Soldiers return home missing limbs and carrying tiny bottles marked comfort. Their suffering eases, their lives do not. It's estimated that more than 400,000 veterans develop what newspapers politely call the soldier's disease, a name that sounds noble enough to ignore. Technology adds another upgrade. In the 1850s, the hypodermic syringe arrives, a small invention that changes everything. Imagine a thin metal needle attached to a glass barrel, gleaming under a lantern. It's the first direct bridge between chemistry and the bloodstream. The logic is simple. If swallowing works, injecting must work faster. It does. It also removes the one thing that used to slow people down: time. The body no longer has a chance to argue with itself. The relief is instant, and so is dependence. For a moment, it looks like civilization has outsmarted pain. Doctors call morphine the God's own medicine. Patients sleep through surgeries that would have once been screams. Writers and philosophers quietly join the trend. Thomas de Quincey pens Confessions of an English Opium Eater, romanticizing his doses as poetic fuel. Society mistakes numbness for enlightenment. Morphine isn't evil, it's simply obedient. It does exactly what it's designed to do: flood the brain's receptors that decide how much pain you should feel. You can think of those receptors as tiny locks, scattered across the brain and spine. Morphine is the key that turns them all at once. For a few hours, everything opens. Then it closes again, harder. The next time, the locks are stiffer, the keys duller, and you need more to reach the same. Quiet. That cycle, relief, tolerance, craving, becomes the invisible rhythm of the century. Medical journals of the 1800s describe morphine dependence with words like habit and nervous weakness. They avoid the language of morality because they still believe in progress. How could a molecule be sinful? It's just carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen arranged in a flattering way. But beneath the elegant structure hides a paradox. Each improvement makes the human relationship with pain more fragile. Imagine a world before anesthesia, where childbirth, surgery, and infection all end in screams. Into that world walks a chemical that can silence agony with the twist of a syringe. Who wouldn't worship it? The tragedy isn't that people used morphine. The tragedy is that it worked exactly as promised. By the 1880s, opium dens in London and San Francisco began filling with those who can't stop chasing the same tranquility they once bought legally. Doctors try to taper patients with smaller doses, unaware that the cure and the disease are now the same substance. Pharmacies begin to experiment with substitutes, trying to design an opiate that relieves pain without seduction. It sounds reasonable, the kind of project that Progress loves. Find the comfort, remove the chaos. That project will eventually produce heroin. But in Sir Turner's time, all of that still lies ahead. The apothecary who dreamed of perfection dies young, unsettled by what his discovery has unleashed. He writes in his final years that morphine should be used with the greatest caution, because in excess it can enslave the soul. It's a strange confession for a man of science, half medical advice, half apology. The world never heeds it. When the next generation of chemists inherits morphine, they see not the warning, but the challenge. If morphine still causes dependence, perhaps the answer is to modify it, to smooth its edges, make it purer, safer, more controllable. They will change a few atoms here and there, perhaps add a pair of tiny chemical handles, and with those small alterations they will believe they have tamed suffering once and for all. What they'll actually create is the most seductive version of relief ever made. A molecule that doesn't just visit the brain's locks, it kicks the doors open. It will be called heroic, a triumph of science and morality. And for a while, it will seem like the world's pain has finally met its match. But for now, the story rests in the quiet between invention and illusion. The syringes are still clean, the chemist still confident, and the flower's old whisper, that soft promise of peace, still sounds convincing. Humanity doesn't yet realize that the line between healing and hunger has already dissolved. At the end of the 19th century, chemistry had begun to sound like a religion. Laboratories were the new cathedrals, glass vials the new stained glass, and the men inside them were priests of progress. They weren't chasing miracles anymore, they were manufacturing them. In 1897, inside a Bayer laboratory in Elberfeld, Germany, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann prepared two experiments only a few days apart. In the first, he stabilized salicylic acid, producing what the world would soon call aspirin. In the second, he modified morphine by attaching two small molecular handles, a process called acetylation. The new compound looked elegant, precise, and harmless. Hoffmann's notebooks described it as remarkably pure and mild. It would later be named diacetyl morphine. For the non-chemist, imagine morphine as a key. Hoffmann simply polished it, smoothed its surface so it could slip through the brain's barrier faster, almost like oil on metal. Once inside, the body quickly removed those new handles, turning it back into morphine. But in that brief window, it crossed the brain's gates at lightning speed, delivering a rush that morphine could never match. It was a shortcut to relief that felt divine. At Bayer's offices, this didn't sound dangerous. It sounded like marketing. The company decided the new drug needed a name that captured its heroic power. In German, heroisch means strong, noble, powerful. And so, in 1898, Bayer introduced to the world its latest wonder product, HEROIN. The tone of the advertisements was almost tender. Posters showed mothers comforting their children with a spoonful of syrup labelled HEROIN. Doctors praised its reliability, saying it relieved coughs, colds, and even the cravings of morphine addicts. It was, they claimed, a non-addictive substitute for morphine itself, a kind of chemical rehabilitation program in a bottle, a perfect circle of mercy. The irony still echoes. The only difference between morphine and heroin was two small attachments that made the drug reach the brain faster and leave a deeper mark. The cure was, chemically speaking, the problem wearing a new hat. But at the time, medicine didn't speak that language. The excitement of modern science drowned out every warning. Imagine a German chemist holding a small vial to the light, watching the clear liquid refract like amber. He doesn't see danger, he sees clarity. He believes he's made pain more humane, as if comfort could be refined the same way sugar can be whitened. The label on early bottles read, HEROIN, for coughs, asthma, tuberculosis. It was sold as lozenges, syrups, and powders. Even children's medicines contained it. Parents were reassured by the professional fonts, the elegant logo, the promise that their family's discomfort could be solved by science. By 1900, heroin was being exported to over 20 countries. Newspapers described it as a wonder drug. The New York Times called it a boon to humanity. Doctors wrote that it cured not just illness but the moral failures of addiction. If someone could stop craving morphine by switching to heroin, then perhaps the world wasn't broken after all. The human mind loves a shortcut, especially one that feels virtuous. Within a decade, reports began surfacing of patients who, after being treated with heroin, couldn't stop taking it. Pharmacies started to notice repeat customers with increasingly vague prescriptions. Hospitals noticed that some patients came back worse, but the evidence was quiet, scattered, and inconvenient. The narrative of progress was louder. Behind the lab doors, scientists were starting to whisper that the drug's effects were unusually strong. They tried to understand why. They discovered that when heroin enters the bloodstream, those extra chemical attachments, the ones Hoffman added, make the molecule slip past the brain's natural defense faster. Inside, the body clips them off, leaving behind plain morphine again. In simple terms, heroin is morphine with wings. It travels faster, hits harder, and fades more suddenly, leaving the brain confused and wanting. But no one wanted to hear about wings. They wanted cures. At the dawn of the 20th century, medicine had become a race to conquer every human weakness. Coughing, pain, anxiety, even sadness, all were treated as mechanical problems that chemistry could fix. Heroin fit that mood perfectly. It was modern, efficient, and moral. What could be more respectable than a German pharmaceutical company saving the world from vice? The truth is that Bayer never lied deliberately. They simply believed their own optimism. The company's pamphlets boasted that heroin was free from the addictive qualities of morphine. To them, it was a new chapter in medical civilization, a chapter written in clean handwriting and corporate pride. Soon, heroin found its way into soldiers' kits, colonial trade routes, and every major city. Even missionaries distributed it, convinced that helping the suffering was holy work. In less than 20 years, the same compound that began as a laboratory improvement had become a global habit. Then came the slow awakening. Doctors realized that patients who took heroin to stop coughing no longer coughed, or slept, or worked, or cared about much else. They came back thinner, trembling, desperate. The miracle had turned into a mirror. By 1914, governments began to panic. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, not to ban heroin outright, but to regulate and tax its sale so tightly that prescribing it became nearly impossible. On paper, it was a matter of paperwork. In practice, it was the start of criminalization. Pain was leaving the clinic and entering the courtroom. The shift was quiet but profound. A problem once treated with sympathy would now be managed with suspicion. Doctors would retreat, police would advance, and heroin, the heroic drug, would begin its long descent into infamy. It's strange to imagine the optimism that filled those early advertisements: shining bottles, clean typography, promises of purity. You can almost hear the faint clink of glass, the confident language of progress. Non-addictive, safe for children, heroic. All of it spoken with the faith that science could save the world from its own emotions. Of course, science can't save anyone from the need to feel good. It can only design better methods. And heroin, pure and perfect, was exactly that. The best method ever invented for turning hope into chemistry. By the early 1900s, heroin was everywhere. Pharmacies stocked it, hospitals relied on it, and families kept bottles of it in their medicine cabinets next to cough drops and tonics. It was modern life in liquid form, a world that could finally medicate its own misery. Advertisements glowed with faith in progress. Mothers spooning syrup into a child's mouth, doctors holding vials like tiny trophies of human triumph. The age of chemistry had replaced the age of prayer, and the new gods wore white coats. At first, everything seemed fine. Heroin's ability to quiet coughing made it indispensable for diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia, which were still deadly at the time. It was also prescribed for insomnia, depression, asthma, and a category of vague complaints politely known as female nerves. It came in powders, lozenges, and even pastilles shaped like candies. The logic was simple. If a medicine could soothe pain and bring calm, then more calm must be better. But the cracks began to show almost immediately. Doctors noticed patients asking for refills more often, arriving earlier than scheduled or insisting that only heroin worked for them. Some described restlessness between doses, a word that barely captured the storm brewing inside their bodies. Others grew pale and thin, unable to eat or sleep unless they'd had their medicine. A few died quietly at home, and their deaths were recorded as exhaustion, not addiction. By 1910, whispers about heroin habits started to circulate in medical journals. Pharmacists were uneasy, but the industry was still too proud to admit it had made a mistake. Bayer continued to export its heroic drug to more than 20 countries, still calling it safe, still describing it as a cure for morphine addiction. The irony was so complete that no one could see it anymore. Even when evidence mounted, denial was easier than reform. Addiction, people said, was a personal weakness. It wasn't the fault of a chemical. It was the failure of character. The very idea that science could produce moral corruption seemed absurd to the modern mind. Chemistry was progress, and progress was pure. In truth, the purity was the problem. Heroin's molecular design, those tiny handles added to morphine, made it slip into the brain faster than any natural compound. It worked in seconds, bypassing the body's slow defences. Imagine a messenger who doesn't knock but walks straight through the door. The brain, flooded with relief, simply surrendered. Once the glow faded, the craving returned, louder each time. The human body, ever cautious, started to adapt, to expect the chemical calm. Without it, everything felt wrong. Skin itched, stomachs churned, sleep vanished, thoughts raced. The same drug that once promised tranquility now dictated it. Across Europe and America, small clinics began opening to treat heroin habitués. Doctors tried to taper patients off slowly, replacing heroin with diluted morphine or laudanum. But the lines outside these clinics grew longer, and the moral patience of society grew shorter. Newspapers started printing warnings: the new menace, the dope fiend, the white poison. Fear always moves faster than understanding. In 1914, the United States introduced the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. On paper, it was a tax regulation, a way to record and monitor the distribution of opiates. In reality, it redefined addiction from a medical condition into a criminal one. Doctors now needed special licenses to prescribe narcotics, and any physician who maintained a patient's dependence risked arrest. Within a few years, heroin prescriptions vanished. The patients, of course, did not. Those cut off from their medication turned to the black market, where purity was measured not in laboratories, but in back rooms. Street dealers filled the vacuum left by physicians. The same drug that once sat neatly on a pharmacy shelf now changed hands in alleys, and so began a century-long dance between law and chemistry, one that neither side would ever win. Meanwhile, governments tried to look decisive. International conferences were held to discuss the opium problem. Diplomats from empires that still traded in colonial poppy fields suddenly discovered moral urgency. Treaties were signed and moral statements made. But even as Europe lectured Asia about cultivation, factories in Germany and Britain kept manufacturing heroin for legitimate export. Commerce disguised itself as compassion. The irony was thick enough to taste. Every attempt to control heroin only made it more profitable. The fewer legal sources there were, the more valuable the illegal ones became. Smugglers thrived, doctors hesitated, addicts suffered, and the public learned to associate the drug not with the hospital, but with crime. The very act of surviving withdrawal became evidence of guilt. By the 1920s, heroin's golden halo had completely tarnished. Bayer quietly stopped producing it, quietly removed the trademark, quietly pretended the word had never belonged to them. Medical journals no longer praised its purity. Instead, they issued warnings in dry, regretful tones. A substance of great therapeutic potential, now irreversibly compromised by abuse. But the damage was already done. The world had learned two lessons it would immediately forget. The first was that you can't cure addiction with newer addiction. The second was that outlawing pain doesn't remove it, it just moves it elsewhere. Somewhere in a city apartment, a former patient still stirred a small spoon over a candle flame, heating a brown residue that used to be medicine. In another room, a doctor burned his old prescription pads, the ones that had once promised healing. On one side of the law sat the same chemical molecule, now called poison. On the other side sat the same people, now called criminals. The air of progress that had filled the early century turned heavy with shame. Yet the world didn't stop chasing relief, it simply changed its clothes. Factories that once sold heroin would move on to barbiturates, amphetamines, tranquilizers. The pattern never changed, only the labels did. Humanity, ever confident, still believed that the right molecule could fix what sadness and hunger could not. And so, with heroin's fall from grace, a new kind of empire began to form. One that traded not in medicine, but in prohibition. It was an empire that would reach across oceans, fund wars, build mafias, and reshape entire continents. The laboratory had lost control, and the streets were about to inherit its invention. When medicine leaves the clinic, it doesn't disappear. It just changes address. By the 1920s, heroin had slipped quietly out of the doctor's hands and into the pockets of smugglers, sailors, and gangsters. A substance once wrapped in gauze and glass now travelled in barrels and paper packets. It no longer cured coughs, it cured the economy of those who were willing to ignore morality for profit. The black market had no interest in science, only in demand, and demand was steady, reliable, and deeply human. The people who once depended on prescriptions were now dependent on strangers. In the silence between laws and supply chains, a new kind of business emerged, global, invisible, and profitable enough to outlast empires. Heroin became an international citizen. Turkey produced the opium, France refined it, America consumed it. The route was elegant in its simplicity. poppy fields in Anatolia, laboratories in Marseille, and 1,000 invisible hands connecting the two. On ships crossing the Mediterranean, wooden crates labelled as medical supplies rattled with glass jars filled with morphine base, the raw material from which heroin was easily made. A few small chemical steps, nothing more complicated than what any pharmacy once did legally. The recipe was simple enough to fit in a notebook, though by now it was more secret than sacred. Marseille became the unofficial capital of this quiet empire. Inside unmarked warehouses, chemists, some trained, some merely bold, cooked the white powder in batches. They worked at night, the air thick with the sting of solvents and the bitter smell of acetone. No one wore lab coats anymore. There were no safety posters or moral speeches, only men, stirring steel pots like modern alchemists, transforming pain into profit. The product moved north, carried by couriers with diplomatic calm. By the time it reached New York or Chicago, it was known by street names whispered like confessions: horse, smack, dope. The French Connection, as journalists later called it, was the world's first true narcotics superhighway. It linked post-war poverty to urban appetite. French chemists, Corsican smugglers, and American gangsters became uneasy business partners. They didn't speak the same language, but money was fluent. In the United States, prohibition had already turned alcohol into an underground industry. Heroin followed the same route, from back rooms to organised networks. The mafia realised that narcotics offered something even better than liquor: customers who couldn't stop buying. Addiction wasn't a flaw in the business model, it was the business model. In alleyways, small-time dealers became pharmacists of despair. A few dollars bought a night of peace. A few more bought the illusion that tomorrow might exist. It was the same chemical that once lived in sterile hospitals, but now it was mixed with chalk, sugar, or powdered milk. Whatever stretched the profit without killing the customer too quickly. Governments responded with moral speeches and harsher laws. Each new restriction made the drug more valuable, the traffickers more ruthless, and the addicts more desperate. It was a perfect economic loop disguised as a tragedy. The hypocrisy was striking. Western powers lectured Asia about cultivation while quietly protecting their own supply lines through intelligence operations. The Cold War only deepened the irony. In Southeast Asia, anti-communist warlords financed their armies through opium. In exchange, they received weapons and quiet tolerance. The same governments that arrested users at home sometimes relied on producers abroad. Meanwhile, ordinary people suffered in silence. Clinics had closed. Treatment had become punishment. A young woman in New York might be arrested for possession, sent to prison instead of therapy. A farmer in Turkey might have his fields burned by police one year and sold to smugglers the next. Everyone was following orders. No one was solving pain. The chemistry stayed the same molecule with the same hooks and wings designed to fly straight into the brain. But the context changed everything. In laboratories, heroin had been a symbol of human control. On the street, it became proof of how little control humanity actually had. You could trace its journey almost like a chemical equation if you wanted to. 1 part desperation, 1 part policy, 1 part profit, shaken until indistinguishable. But no blackboard could hold that formula, because it was written in lives instead of symbols. In the 1930s, heroin began to pick up cultural shadows. Jazz musicians whispered about it. Writers hinted at it. The drug became both muse and curse, the secret heartbeat of smoky clubs and lost weekends. Society's most creative minds flirted with the same chemistry that governments condemned. It wasn't rebellion, just curiosity wrapped in despair. And in the background, a quiet hum. Ships docking, barrels unloading, governments pretending not to notice. By mid-century, the heroin network stretched across continents, from the poppy fields of Asia to the ports of Europe and the alleys of American cities. No war, no treaty, and no moral crusade could stop it for long. Every crackdown only trimmed one branch, 2 more grew in its place. The irony was too neat to ignore. The more humanity tried to outlaw its need for relief, the more relief went into hiding. You can't arrest a craving any more than you can tax a heartbeat. The poppy didn't care who claimed to own it. It bloomed wherever human suffering created demand. So by the time the world declared a war on drugs, the drugs were already veterans. Heroin had outlived its inventors, its trademarks, its warnings. It had slipped from the medical to the moral, from the moral to the criminal, and from the criminal to the inevitable. In a way, the underworld hadn't stolen heroin at all. It had merely inherited it, the way a child inherits a parent's unfinished mistakes. What began as a chemical quest to conquer pain had become a global apprenticeship in hypocrisy, and somewhere, far from the headlines, the original flower still bloomed, quiet, white, and waiting, as if to remind us that no one ever truly controls what they create. The medicine cabinet of civilization was now open to the world, and the world had decided to help itself. By the middle of the 20th century, heroin had stopped belonging to any one nation. It had become global, not by design but by demand. And like every empire of profit, it eventually moved where oversight was weakest. The new capital of that empire wasn't in Europe or America. It was in the humid hills where Laos, Burma and Thailand meet, a region the world would come to call the Golden Triangle. On a map, it looks like a cluster of misty mountains, green and unremarkable. But for decades, this landscape supplied most of the planet's heroin. The soil was perfect for poppy cultivation, rich, remote, and politically untidy. Farmers here didn't grow narcotics, they grew survival. Opium was the only crop that could be stored, traded, or carried down a mountain without spoiling. It was a flower that paid school fees and bought rice. The rest of the world would call it vice. The locals called it income. Then came the Cold War, a contest supposedly about ideology, but also about influence. The United States poured money into Southeast Asia to contain communism. In the chaos that followed, warlords, militias, and intelligence agencies all found common ground in the poppy field. Some factions taxed opium to buy weapons, others tolerated it in exchange for cooperation. It was the kind of moral math only geopolitics could justify. The region's mountains turned into a patchwork of small kingdoms, each ruled by a man with soldiers, laboratories, and loyalty for sale. The opium was collected, packed into mule caravans, and traded for morphine base, a thick paste that would later be cooked into heroin. The chemistry was simple. Add a few reagents, heat, filter, and the brown paste turned white. It's a transformation no more mysterious than baking bread, but far more profitable. In this setting, heroin became a kind of currency. Guns were bought with it, roads were built with it, and wars were quietly financed through it. Everyone involved pretended not to know. Western intelligence agencies looked the other way as long as the flow of information and opium favoured their side. A paradox formed. In trying to fight one enemy, they fed another. The Golden Triangle didn't invent heroin, but it perfected its logistics. Small planes flew sacks of opium out of jungle airstrips, sometimes under official insignias. Rivers became trade routes. Monasteries sometimes served as way stations. It wasn't just a business. It was a parallel economy, one that answered only to necessity. When the monsoon came and roads washed away, villagers prayed that the poppy pods would still stand upright. For them, each harvest meant food, not crime. At the same time, in the cities of the West, heroin's image darkened. Jazz clubs in New York and Paris were haunted by its ghost. The drug that once symbolized modern medicine was now synonymous with urban decay. Politicians promised to cleanse the streets, but never questioned why those streets were flooded in the first place. Every bag of powder confiscated by the police was another echo from those distant hills, a message written in chemistry and poverty. The global supply chain of heroin resembled a living organism. Its roots were in remote farms, its veins were smuggler routes, and its heartbeat was demand. Whenever authorities cut off one route, the organism simply grew another. A crackdown in Turkey led to expansion in Burma. A crop eradication campaign in Laos pushed production deeper into the jungle. The system adapted faster than policy could react. It was evolution powered by addiction. There's dark symmetry to it. The same optimism that once filled European laboratories now filled jungle huts. Chemists in Marseille had once believed they were saving humanity. Chemists in the Golden Triangle believed they were saving their families. Each worked with the same molecule, each convinced of necessity. When profit meets suffering, ethics rarely survives the transaction. By the 1960s, this flow of heroin was unstoppable. Shipments disguised as tea or coffee moved through Hong Kong, then into the United States and Europe. Soldiers in Vietnam found it cheaper and purer than anything available at home. Some smoked it, some injected it, and many returned from war with new wounds, the kind that medicine couldn't heal. Heroin followed them home, tucked in their memories and their veins. The irony was merciless. While the world declared wars in the name of peace, heroin quietly declared peace in the name of escape. A single gram could erase an entire day's worth of fear. For soldiers, for farmers, for the forgotten poor, it was the same transaction, pain traded for oblivion. Governments responded with predictable outrage. More police, more prisons, more speeches about moral decay. But none of those things addressed the geography of desperation. You can't burn a field that feeds a family and call it victory. You can't lecture a village that only grows what the world buys. By the early 1970s, the Golden Triangle's heroin supplied roughly 2/3 of the global market. Its profit supported warlords, corrupted officials, and underwrote conflicts that had nothing to do with drugs. The same planes that carried rice for refugees sometimes carried morphine paste on the return trip. It was logistics at its most flexible. Meanwhile, a new pattern began to emerge, one that would soon define the rest of the century. As Western soldiers and cities became addicted, the conversation began to shift from chemistry to morality, from policy to punishment. Addiction, once treated as illness, was now evidence of weakness. The irony of that shift was almost too neat. While governments funded covert operations with opium money abroad, they arrested the users of its final product at home. Through all this, the poppy itself remained innocent. It grew where the soil was kind and the sun consistent, oblivious to the flags and borders drawn around it. A flower doesn't know who profits from its sap, it just knows how to bloom. And somewhere, in the quiet between gunfire and rainfall, a farmer bent over his field and scored another pod with a knife. Milky sap bled out thick and slow, collecting in a tin bowl. He wiped his brow, looked at the horizon, and saw neither sin nor salvation. Just another day's work. By the late 1960s, heroin had followed soldiers into the jungle. It didn't arrive with fanfare, just quietly, the way most things that change the world tend to do. Among the endless rain, the hum of insects, and the smell of damp uniforms, there appeared small glassine packets of white powder, so pure it looked almost innocent. It was nicknamed China White, a delicate name for something that erased reality with chemical precision. In the chaos of the Vietnam War, it was easy to find. Local producers in Southeast Asia could refine morphine base into heroin so pure it didn't need a needle. Soldiers smoked it in cigarettes, mixed it with tobacco, or dissolved it into makeshift pipes made from spent shell casings. A moment of calm in a place where calm was otherwise impossible. The logic made sense. Pain was everywhere. Physical, emotional, existential. Every step through mud and gunfire felt like an argument with the universe. And heroin ended the argument for a while. It dulled fear, softened grief, and turned the noise of helicopters into something almost musical. By 1971, military surveys estimated that roughly 1 in 7 American soldiers stationed in Vietnam had used heroin regularly. Officials were horrified. But privately they understood. The substance didn't change. Only the setting did. The same molecule that once came in a doctor's bottle now came folded into a matchbook. But its purpose remained the same, to make unbearable moments survivable. Soldiers called it going to sleep awake, a poetic phrase for surrender. When the war ended and the soldiers returned home, the government braced for an epidemic of addiction. The fear was rational, based on chemistry. Heroin rewires the brain's pleasure systems, locking them into expectation. Once those receptors have learned the shortcut to relief, they rarely forget it. So the prediction was simple. Thousands of veterans would remain addicted forever. But the data betrayed that prophecy. When researchers followed the soldiers home, they discovered something unexpected. The majority simply stopped. No clinics, no miracles, just distance from the jungle. Their cravings faded like fever dreams. The same men who couldn't go a day without heroin in Saigon walked away from it in suburban America. This became one of the most quietly revolutionary findings in the history of addiction science. A group of researchers led by Dr. Lee Robbins studied returning veterans and found that addiction wasn't just chemistry, it was environment. When the context of danger, fear, and isolation disappeared, so did the need for chemical armour. The molecule was powerful, yes, but it was not destiny. The discovery should have changed everything. It showed that addiction could be situational, a response to unbearable surroundings rather than a permanent defect of character. But policy doesn't like nuance. It prefers villains and victories. And so the lesson was politely ignored. The soldiers came home to parades that never happened, to jobs that no longer existed, to a society that had lost its appetite for war stories. Those who still struggled with heroin were quietly abandoned. Treatment options were limited, and most communities chose punishment instead. If the jungle had been chaos, home was bureaucracy, cleaner but somehow colder. For many, heroin became a bridge between two worlds, the noise of combat and the silence of civilian life. It kept them from feeling too sharply, too suddenly. They weren't chasing euphoria anymore, they were chasing neutrality. But neutrality is expensive, and peace never stays cheap. The heroin that had cost next to nothing in Asia became unaffordable in America. Supply chains shifted, purity dropped, and the drug returned to the syringe. The smell of diesel and gunpowder was replaced by the mildew of basement apartments. The jungle humidity became city sweat. A new phase of the story was beginning, one that would move from soldiers to civilians, from battlefield wounds to the invisible wounds of modern life. In the wider picture, the Vietnam era revealed something about humanity that medicine had never fully admitted. People use drugs not because they are weak, but because they are trying to survive their circumstances. The soldiers weren't broken, they were adapting. And when those circumstances vanished, many of them adapted again, leaving the habit behind like an old uniform. It should have been a moment of humility for science and policy alike. But humility rarely wins elections. Instead, the 1970s launched the next chapter of the war on drugs, a campaign that treated context as excuse and punishment as cure. The image of the junkie soldier became propaganda, proof that drugs were a national threat rather than a symptom of something deeper. The truth, of course, is quieter. Addiction, like war, is a condition of environment. It thrives in stress, isolation, and hopelessness. Remove those, and even the strongest drug loses its grip. Imagine the silence after a monsoon. The rain stops, the air still hums, but everything feels new and oddly empty. That's what recovery looked like for many soldiers. Not dramatic, not heroic, just an absence where noise used to be. The brain, once flooded with chemical calm, finally learned to rest on its own. Some of them carried the memory of heroin for decades. They could still describe its taste, its warmth, the way it made the world slow down. But the craving wasn't for the drug. It was for the feeling of safety that the drug had imitated. And safety, unlike heroin, can sometimes return naturally. The jungle was gone, the needles discarded, and the statistics quietly filed away in government archives. Yet the lesson lingers like humidity, unseen but persistent. Addiction is never just a matter of molecules. It's a reflection of what people are forced to endure. So when the helicopters left and the soldiers scattered back to their hometowns, they carried more than memories. They carried proof. Proof that chemistry may start an addiction, but only context keeps it alive. When the soldiers returned from Vietnam, they came home to a country that had lost interest in heroes. The factories were closing, the neighbourhoods were ageing, and the optimism that once filled post-war America had been pawned for spare change. Jobs disappeared, rent rose, and the television spoke in a language of success that no one in the city could afford to learn. And into that vacuum, heroin quietly walked in again, not as a medicine, not as rebellion, but as routine. The returning soldiers, still carrying the chemical memory of calm, found the same white powder waiting for them in alleys and apartments. Only this time, it wasn't wrapped in paper stamped with military codes. It came folded in foil branded with street names that sounded like parody. Blue Magic, Tango, Harlem Gold. It wasn't chemistry that had changed, it was the economy. Deindustrialization had emptied entire blocks, leaving behind broken windows and bored young men with nothing to sell but escape. Heroin became a kind of small business, low investment, high demand, permanent clientele. Dealers learned to brand their product like cereal companies, stamping each bag with a logo or slogan. Guaranteed, good stuff, Eagle brand. The competition was fierce. Capitalism, stripped to formality, had found its last and most loyal customer, the addict. In this strange inversion, the underworld became an entrepreneur's paradise. A good dealer offered consistency, courtesy, and clean needles. The worst ones offered none of that, but made up for it with violence. Territory became currency. Entire neighbourhoods turned into open-air pharmacies, selling relief by the hour. You could trace the rise of crime statistics like a heartbeat of supply and demand. Inside apartments, the rituals of use became communal. Someone cooked the powder in a spoon over a candle, drawing it into a syringe with quiet reverence. The sound of boiling water replaced the sound of conversation. Outside, children played on the stoops while their parents disappeared behind curtains. The city learned to live with its new silence, the hush of sedation, the absence of ambition. Politicians saw only moral failure. They declared another war, this one not against a foreign enemy, but against a chemical one. The phrase war on drugs sounded decisive, cinematic, and tidy. What it really meant was more police, more prisons, and less empathy. The irony was almost mathematical. Every addict arrested made space for a new one. Every dealer jailed was replaced by two others who saw an opportunity. In the media, heroin became shorthand for decay. Newspapers printed photographs of bodies slumped against brick walls, calling them the casualties of pleasure. Yet behind each photograph was a story that wasn't about pleasure at all. It was about survival, loneliness, and the human ability to tolerate despair if it comes in small enough doses. In New York, Harlem became both symbol and scapegoat. Figures like Nicky Barnes, sharp suits, diamond rings, quiet confidence, were both admired and despised. To the newspapers, he was the villain. To many in his community, he was proof that power was still possible. He organised distribution with the precision of a corporate executive. Meetings were held, quotas set, profits tracked. It was business, stripped of its moral costume. The irony, of course, is that the same economic system that created billionaires in skyscrapers created kingpins in basements. Both sold dreams. Both depended on customers who couldn't stop wanting. The only difference was legality. One paid taxes, the other paid bribes. By the mid-1970s, heroin use had spread beyond the cities. Suburban teenagers, fascinated by the forbidden, followed its trail back into their own bedrooms. The drug crossed racial and class lines faster than any social movement ever had. Yet policy stayed the same. Punishment first, understanding never. At the same time, methadone clinics began appearing. Small, underfunded attempts at harm reduction. Methadone was a slower, steadier opioid designed to satisfy the same receptors without the chaos. Imagine it as a version of heroin that whispers instead of shouts. It was meant to stabilize, not intoxicate. For some, it worked. For others, it became just another dependency, another daily ritual to hide or manage. Still, for a moment, there was hope. The idea that addiction could be treated, not punished, briefly flickered. But stigma is a powerful institution. Politicians needed villains more than patients, and the phrase methadone maintenance didn't sell newspapers. Drug war did. By the end of the decade, America had learned to monetize both sides of the epidemic. Police budgets swelled, private prisons flourished, rehabilitation clinics charged like hotels. An entire economy grew around addiction, an ecosystem of punishment and treatment feeding off the same despair. It was, in its own terrible way, efficient. Meanwhile, the street-level economy kept evolving. Dealers introduced new mixtures, blending heroin with quinine, sugar, even powdered milk. Each cut reduced purity but stretched profit. Each bag was a gamble, a game where the prize could be peace or death. Yet the customers kept coming, drawn not by greed but by gravity, the body's simple need to feel normal again. Somewhere in this noise, the idea of normal began to collapse. Addiction wasn't rebellion anymore. It was background noise, part of the urban soundtrack. The sound of sirens, the hiss of a lighter, the soft click of a syringe. These were the lullabies of a city that had run out of lullabies. And through it all, the economy adapted. The people who sold heroin didn't call themselves criminals. They were businessmen who simply supplied what everyone else refused to acknowledge. The persistent demand for numbness. They called it survival. The government called it sin. By the end of the 1970s, heroin had completed its second transformation, from medicine to crime, and now to commerce. It no longer needed the glamour of rebellion or the approval of doctors. It had found something sturdier, necessity. What began as a laboratory mistake had become a mirror of modern society, efficient, transactional, and quietly indifferent to the cost. The factories that once built machines now built addicts. The workers who once produced steel now produce statistics. The product was always the same, something to help you forget the day. As the decade closed, America had two wars running side by side, one overseas and one at home. Both were expensive, endless, and profitable for the right people. And in the ruins of those cities, beneath the billboards and campaign slogans, heroin kept doing what it had always done, delivering silence to those who could no longer afford hope. By the 1990s, heroin had slipped into an entirely new disguise. It was no longer a back-alley habit or a whispered tragedy. It had become, impossibly, a style. The cities were cleaner now, at least on the surface. The crime waves of the 1970s had faded into nostalgia, and the economy was humming again. But beneath the gloss, something restless lingered. People were tired of perfection. They were bored of sparkle, and nothing was more glamorous, it seemed, than looking like you'd stopped trying to survive. Fashion, ever hungry for a new kind of rebellion, found its muse in exhaustion. Photographers began to prefer models who looked translucent, hollow, almost ghostly, thin shoulders, dark eyes, pale lips. It was the aesthetic of fragility, the human body as a candle burning at both ends. This new look earned a name that sounded like a joke but wasn't. Heroin chic. The irony was almost cruel. For a drug that had destroyed so many lives, it now became the blueprint for beauty. Magazines filled with photographs of models slumped against walls, staring through the camera as if through a fog. The lighting was flat, the makeup smudged. the poses languid. It wasn't seduction anymore, it was surrender. The message was subtle but clear. Pain was fashionable, vulnerability was erotic, and detachment was the new confidence. At the centre of this movement stood names that would soon become famous: photographer Corinne Day, model Kate Moss, designer Calvin Klein. Moss appeared in black and white images wearing underwear that looked more like absence than fashion. The tagline was, "Nothing comes between me and my Calvins," a sentence that somehow managed to sound both defiant and desperately tired. The look spread fast. In an age of rising luxury, heroin chic felt like protest. Against consumerism, against perfection, against anything that required effort. To look unhealthy was to appear authentic. It said, "I'm not trying anymore, and that's my rebellion." And the world applauded. The strange part is that very few of the people behind the images were actually using heroin. The drug was symbolic, shorthand for disillusionment. It represented a world too numb to care and too stylish to admit it. But symbolism, once released, rarely stays abstract. Real heroin seeped back into the margins of art, music, and nightlife. It had been there before, in the 1970s rock scene, and now it returned, this time with velvet gloves. The 1990s had perfected irony. Death was aesthetic, addiction was poetic. And the camera clicked softly, preserving every sigh. Then came a photograph that changed everything. Davide Sorrenti, a young fashion photographer whose work captured the beauty of frailty, died in 1997 from a heroin overdose. He was only 20. The same lenses that had glorified his style now documented his funeral. The industry suddenly found itself staring at the consequence of its own obsession. The illusion cracked. Politicians took notice. Even the President of the United States condemned the heroin chic trend, calling it a celebration of sickness. The same magazines that once published the images now published apologies. Designers disavowed the aesthetic they had built. But by then the damage was done. The world had learned a dangerous truth. Addiction could sell, and so could its ghost. The images didn't vanish. They simply changed costumes. What had once been called heroin chic would reappear years later as grunge glamour, sad girl aesthetics, or washed beauty. Each new name was just a way to recycle the same fascination with collapse. Society, it turned out, wasn't addicted to heroin. It was addicted to watching what heroin did to people. In the background, the actual epidemic continued quietly. While magazines printed contrition, hospitals filled with overdoses. In some cities, purity levels of street heroin rose to unprecedented levels, chemistry responding to competition. Dealers learned that a more potent product meant better loyalty. The fashion world might have moved on, but the body count did not. The irony of the decade was almost perfect. A society obsessed with health and fitness simultaneously adored the image of weakness. Gym memberships soared while models looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks. Self-help books promised empowerment, while runway shows paraded women who looked one gust of wind away from vanishing. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was theatre. And in this theatre, heroin played the role of the forbidden muse, deadly, seductive, and useful. Even its language infiltrated pop culture. A hit song could be called heroin. A nightclub might be described as addictive. The metaphor became marketing. And once a metaphor becomes marketing, it never dies. If you close your eyes and imagine a 1990s fashion shoot, you can almost smell the mix of cigarette smoke, perfume, and artificial fog. A fan hums softly. A camera shutter clicks, once, twice, 3 times. The photographer says, "Perfect," and no one knows if he means the photo or the emptiness inside it. The story of heroin chic is not really about drugs. It's about beauty learning to imitate despair. It's about how culture takes something tragic and polishes it until it can be sold. The models weren't villains. They were symptoms. So were the photographers, the editors, the audience. Everyone was complicit. Everyone was tired, and everyone was quietly flattered by how good misery looked under good lighting. When the trend finally died, it didn't end because people grew wiser. It ended because the market shifted. Bright colours came back. Gloss returned. Magazines wanted smiles again, but the residue remained. Proof that, even after a century of devastation, heroin could still find new ways to enter the bloodstream of culture. There's a particular cruelty in that endurance. Long after the laboratories closed, long after the laws tightened, the idea of heroin survived, not as substance but as symbol, the promise of effortless detachment, the comfort of indifference, the aesthetic of vanishing. It was no longer about chemistry at all. It had become a style of living. And so, at the end of the 20th century, the world stood in front of a mirror it had built itself, one that reflected not beauty, not power, but fatigue. The drug that once silenced pain had now become the language of fashion. Heroin had done the impossible. It made despair marketable. The story of heroin in the 1990s wasn't just about art and illusion. While magazines turned addiction into an aesthetic, a quieter revolution was unfolding inside hospitals, one that looked merciful on paper and catastrophic in practice. It began, as all revolutions do, with good intentions. Doctors wanted to treat pain more seriously. Patients demanded comfort. Pharmaceutical companies offered help, and help, as it turned out, came in the shape of a small beige pill named OxyContin. It was introduced in 1996 by Purdue Pharma, a family-owned company with a clean image and a simple slogan, relief you can count on. The pill contained oxycodone, a cousin of morphine, bound to a slow-release coating that was supposed to drip its effect gradually through the bloodstream over 12 hours. It was marketed as safe, as science's long-awaited solution to the age-old problem of pain. The brochures even said so in precise fonts, non-addictive when used as prescribed. The logic seemed sound. If morphine could comfort the dying, surely its modern cousin could help the living. People with bad backs, joint pain, post-surgical soreness, or just the everyday aches of a long life. Doctors were urged to stop undertreating pain, to think of it as the fifth vital sign, alongside pulse, temperature, breathing, and blood pressure. It was a poetic idea. Measure suffering as you would a heartbeat. But pain is not a number, and chemistry doesn't read poetry. The slow-release formula was meant to keep blood levels steady, avoiding the rush that causes addiction. But the human body, clever as always, found a loophole. People discovered that by crushing the pills, dissolving the coating, the medicine released all at once. The effect was immediate, euphoric, and far from slow. A drug meant to dull pain became indistinguishable from heroin, except cleaner and easier to find. Meanwhile, the company's sales representatives visited doctors' offices with charts, samples, and lunch trays. They promised better patient outcomes, fewer sleepless nights, and a 1% addiction risk, a number later revealed to have no scientific foundation at all. It was a masterpiece of persuasion, medicine dressed as mathematics. By the early 2000s, prescriptions skyrocketed. Pharmacies filled bottles by the millions. Billboards showed smiling patients holding tennis rackets and coffee cups, the picture of comfortable productivity. Pain was no longer something to endure. It was something to medicate. The result was predictable, though no one seemed to predict it. Communities that had barely known heroin now found themselves awash in legal opioids. Rural towns, especially in Appalachia and the Midwest, saw pharmacies dispensing more painkillers than there were residents. Some doctors wrote prescriptions out of compassion, some out of pressure, and a few simply out of greed. Whatever the motive, the effect was the same. An entire population introduced to chemical relief. Dependence followed quietly, disguised at first as gratitude. People said they finally felt normal again, that they could work, sleep, or play with their children without hurting. But when the prescription ended, the pain returned. amplified, merciless. The brain, having learned to outsource its comfort, demanded its contractor back. Patients begged for refills, and when refused, turned to whatever they could find. It was during this time that a new phrase entered medical vocabulary: pseudo-addiction. It described patients who seemed dependent but supposedly weren't. They were just under-medicated. The solution, doctors were told, was to give them more. The phrase spread quickly, supported by glossy pamphlets and confident lectures. The word sounded scientific. It was, in fact, a sales strategy. By the time the lie unravelled, it was too late. Across the country, small towns were littered with empty prescription bottles and full cemeteries. When the supply of pills finally tightened, users didn't stop. They simply switched. Street heroin, cheaper and stronger, filled the gap. In some places, overdose deaths tripled in a year. The line between the pharmacy and the alley had vanished entirely. What made this wave different from previous ones was its respectability. The people affected weren't outsiders or criminals. They were teachers, nurses, veterans, parents, people who had followed instructions, taken medicine, and believed in the system that offered it. The stigma softened briefly, until policymakers realised that empathy is expensive. Then the old language returned: abuser, junkie, failure. The pendulum swung from overprescription to overpunishment, as if the two extremes were opposites rather than twins. In laboratories, scientists began developing treatments to reverse overdoses: naloxone, a nasal spray that could restore breathing within seconds. Emergency workers carried it in their kits. Volunteers distributed it in public parks. Each small orange bottle was an act of rebellion against despair. But the larger system barely changed. The same forces that had overprescribed now underfunded recovery. Addiction remained profitable, first to create, then to cure. In this new century of medicine, irony became institutional. Hospitals posted signs reminding doctors to treat pain aggressively, while legislators passed laws restricting the very drugs that made it possible. Patients swung between overmedication and neglect, trapped between compassion and compliance. And through it all, the molecules behaved exactly as they always had, doing what they were designed to do, no more, no less. Oxycodone, like morphine and heroin before it, didn't care about morality. It attached itself to the brain's receptors, those tiny locks that control suffering and pleasure. It opened them smoothly, gave relief, and asked for nothing, until it did. The opioid crisis of the 1990s and 2000s wasn't born from malice or madness. It was born from the simplest human instinct: to avoid pain. And pain, being democratic, never runs out of customers. If you listen closely to the quiet hum of a hospital corridor, you can almost hear the echo of the whole story. The rattle of pill bottles, the shuffle of patients, the murmur of doctors promising comfort. The scene is sterile, fluorescent, but beneath it hums the same music that played in every other era: the search for peace, outsourced to chemistry. By the end of the 2000s, lawsuits began to mount, documentaries were made, apologies issued. Purdue Pharma would later declare bankruptcy, its owners facing the weight of 1 million tragedies written in pill form. But no apology can close the loop between intention and outcome. The chemical cycle simply moved on, from morphine to heroin to oxycodone, each a mirror of the same desire wearing a new label. Pain, once called the enemy, had become an industry, and relief, once called mercy, had become a business plan. When the 20th century ended, the world thought it had finally learned its lesson. It hadn't. The laboratories of Europe had closed, the factories of America had been sued, and the pharmaceutical promises of safe opioids were falling apart. But somewhere between the mountains of Central Asia and the edges of the Hindu Kush, a familiar flower was quietly blooming again. It didn't read policy reports. It didn't know about class action lawsuits. It only knew sunlight, water, and survival. Afghanistan, scarred by decades of conflict, became the new centre of an old industry. After the fall of the Taliban in 2001, the country was flooded with aid, soldiers, and uncertainty. Roads were repaired, but not the economy. Poppies, however, didn't need permission to grow. The red flowers spread across valleys and plains like a quiet rebellion against poverty. For farmers, the choice was simple math. Wheat fed the family, opium fed the future. Each harvest began before dawn. Farmers scored the green pods with small blades, letting the milky sap bleed out slowly. It dried into dark brown resin, the same sticky promise that had travelled through empires for millennia. The smell was earthy, almost sweet. When packed into sacks, it resembled nothing dangerous, just another crop ready for trade. The irony was immediate and heavy. Western nations had invaded Afghanistan to fight terror, but found themselves standing in the middle of the world's largest opium field. Their war on one enemy quietly financed another. US and NATO forces tried to implement eradication campaigns, burning poppy fields in the name of stability. But every time a field was destroyed, a family lost its income, and every time a family lost income, another warlord gained a recruit. The Taliban, pragmatic as ever, taxed the trade. They didn't need to grow poppies, they just needed to let others grow them. A small agriculture fee, a few checkpoints, and suddenly the war machine had its own revenue stream. The same system that had once relied on ideology now relied on resin. In the cities, laboratories turned the sap into morphine base. It wasn't advanced chemistry, just cooking pots, heat, and patience. The paste would be wrapped, loaded onto trucks, and smuggled across porous borders. From there, it travelled west along what came to be called the Balkan route, through Iran, Turkey, the Balkans, and into Europe. Each border crossing was an equation of risk and reward. Police confiscated some, officials pocketed more, and the rest disappeared into night. By the mid-2000s, Afghanistan supplied more than 80% of the world's opium. The global economy, always adaptable, found its most consistent export: misery. International conferences followed, diplomats in polished suits discussing alternative livelihoods for farmers who didn't have electricity. Aid programs paid them to plant wheat, but wheat rotted in storage while opium sold for gold. You can't bribe logic with paperwork. In this new century, the poppy became a kind of political weather vane. When governments were strong, production dipped. When they collapsed, it flourished. After 2021, when the Taliban returned to power, the group announced a ban on poppy cultivation, an echo of their earlier prohibition in 2000. For a brief season, fields were cut down again, prices soared, the world applauded, and quietly production shifted eastward to Myanmar. Supply hates a vacuum. The cycle repeated itself with eerie familiarity. Prohibition, scarcity, substitution, abundance. It was the same rhythm the world had danced to for over 100 years. Only the geography changed. In rural Afghan villages, you could still find farmers explaining their choices with the simplicity of survival. A poppy gives me 10 times what wheat gives, one might say, holding up calloused hands. I don't need to understand chemistry, I just need to eat. The moral debates of distant capitals never reached them. To them, opium was not sin or salvation. It was economics written in sunlight and soil. The paradox is that these farmers often despised addiction. They saw what the drug did to users abroad, but their relationship to the plant was agricultural, not chemical. They sold the raw resin, never the refined poison. The transformation from sap to substance happened elsewhere, in laboratories they would never see. In that sense, the world's heroin habit was built on a perfect illusion. The pain of one half of humanity subsidizing the numbness of the other. The planes that flew over Afghanistan carried soldiers, diplomats, and sometimes, without acknowledgement, the consequences of policy. Beneath their flight paths, the red poppy fields shimmered under black smoke from burning waste. It was a landscape both beautiful and accusatory. Every petal seemed to whisper the same reminder. You can't bomb hunger out of existence. The war on drugs, now decades old, had achieved an odd kind of equilibrium. It never won, never ended, never left. Farmers planted, traffickers transported, governments condemned, and economies adjusted. The rhythm was too profitable to stop. When you look at a poppy, it's hard to imagine the numbers behind it. The billions of dollars, the millions of users, the thousands of lives lost each year. It's just a flower, fragile and temporary. Yet this small organism had managed to outlast empires, ideologies, and generations of human promises to do better next time. By the end of the 2010s, some Western nations began to whisper about a new approach: harm reduction, treatment instead of punishment. But that was far away from the Afghan valleys, where the air smelled of dust and diesel, and where survival had never been theoretical. As the 21st century marched on, heroin's old empire began to lose ground, not to morality but to chemistry. In laboratories in Mexico and China, new synthetic opioids appeared, faster, cheaper, stronger, and entirely man-made. They didn't need sunlight or farmers. They didn't grow in soil. They grew in spreadsheets. Heroin's reign, long and bloody, was about to be challenged by something even more efficient. Still, for a moment, just one quiet moment, Afghanistan's poppy field stood as the planet's most tragic mirror. A nation rebuilding itself on the only crop guaranteed to sell. A flower that had once promised peace now paying for endless war. And in that contradiction, you can almost hear history sighing. A long, tired breath that sounds a lot like inevitability. By the time heroin had circled the globe for the third time, human ingenuity did what it always does. It looked at nature and said, "We can make that faster." The poppy, beautiful but unreliable, required weather, soil, labour and warlords. Fentanyl required none of those things. It was chemistry without farming, profit without sunlight. The story began quietly in the 1960s, when a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen synthesized a new painkiller for surgical anesthesia. He wasn't trying to create a monster. He was trying to make morphine more efficient for operating rooms. Fentanyl, his invention, was about 50 times stronger than morphine by weight. A grain the size of a grain of salt could knock out pain for hours. In hospitals, it became a miracle, a precise, clean, controllable tool. For decades it stayed that way. You'd find it in glass vials and transdermal patches, used to sedate patients or manage severe cancer pain. It was medicine behaving itself. But the design was too elegant to stay contained. Like every tool humans invent, someone eventually realized it could be reprogrammed for pleasure. In the early 2000s, criminal chemists and cartels learned how to produce fentanyl in bulk. The recipe wasn't complicated for those who knew the art of synthesis. Start with a few legal precursors, lab-made building blocks that smelled faintly of pepper and metal, and string them together like beads on a molecular necklace. The result? A powder thousands of times more profitable per kilogram than heroin, and far easier to hide. There was no need for fields or farmers, no transport convoys through mountains. A small laboratory the size of a kitchen could make enough to supply an entire city. Shipments could be sent in envelopes or mixed into other drugs, pressed into fake pills that look like painkillers, or cut into heroin to stretch supply. One pinch too much, and the difference between high and death was measured not in grams but in breaths. This new chapter of the story was called the synthetic era, but industrialized escape might be more accurate. The trade no longer depended on plants or weather. It depended on algorithms, logistics, and chemical know-how. The cartels embraced it like an upgrade. Why wait for the poppy to grow when the laboratory never sleeps? In places like Mexico, small clandestine labs began to hum day and night. They weren't sophisticated, a few metal pots, scales, respirators, and men with steady hands. Precursors arrived from abroad, mostly from factories in China and later India. Each shipment was legal enough to pass customs and vague enough to hide intent. The same substances used to make anesthetics or perfumes could, with slight rearrangement, become fentanyl. It was chemistry's version of forgery. When the first waves of fentanyl-laced heroin hit the United States, no one understood what was happening. Users who had survived heroin for years began dying in clusters. A single batch could wipe out an entire neighborhood. Toxicologists were stunned. The potency was too high, the dosage margin too narrow. Fentanyl had a half-life, the time it lingers in the body, shorter than heroin, which meant withdrawal came faster, cravings sharper, tolerance higher. It was a drug designed for the efficiency of hospitals now unleashed into chaos. Dealers, many of them unaware of the math they were playing with, mixed it into heroin, cocaine, and counterfeit pain pills. A teaspoon misjudged by a fraction meant dozens of overdoses. For users, the risk was invisible. The white powder looked the same, only the outcome changed. By 2016, fentanyl had overtaken heroin as the leading cause of overdose deaths in North America. The crisis spread like digital code, too fast for traditional enforcement to keep up. Laws could ban chemicals, but chemists simply modified one small part of the molecule, creating analogues. Each new variant was technically legal until it wasn't. It was a lethal game of molecular hide-and-seek. The irony was total. After a century of trying to control a flower, humanity lost control of a formula. You can burn a field, but you can't burn an idea. Once chemistry learns a trick, it never forgets. The social landscape changed too. Fentanyl made addiction more solitary. Heroin had required rituals: heating, dissolving, sharing. Fentanyl needed almost nothing. It could be smoked, snorted, swallowed, or touched accidentally. Emergency rooms began stocking naloxone by the box, and first responders learned to carry it like firefighters carry oxygen. In some towns, librarians and bus drivers became impromptu medics, saving strangers with a spray that could reverse death in seconds. It was a strange mercy, science cleaning up after itself. The same field that had given the world morphine, heroin, oxycodone and fentanyl had also given it naloxone, a quiet antidote small enough to fit in a pocket, strong enough to restart a heartbeat. Yet even that solution struggled against the scale of the problem. The new economy of addiction was too efficient. A kilogram of fentanyl, smaller than a bag of sugar, could yield 500,000 doses. The profit margin was absurd, the risks minimal, the moral distance infinite. Factories produced precursors by the ton, claiming ignorance. Laboratories tweaked recipes to stay ahead of bans. Dealers mixed powders by guesswork. And users, often unaware of what they were taking, slipped into silence before they could even call for help. The synthetic revolution had done what the agricultural one never could. It removed nature from the equation entirely. No rain, no soil, no seasons, just endless production. It was progress at its most cynical. Meanwhile, headlines filled with numbers: 100,000 deaths a year, 10,000 more the next. The digits blurred together like statistics from a distant war. And perhaps that's what it was. Another war fought without winners. The battlefield just moved from poppy fields to laboratories, from villages to warehouses, from soldiers to civilians. If you close your eyes and picture it, the new drug trade doesn't smell of soil anymore. It smells of solvents, plastic, and burnt wires. The hum of fluorescent lights replaces birdsong. The poppy, once a symbol of both beauty and guilt, has been retired. In its place stands a beaker, clear, silent, and obedient. And yet, even in this sterile world, the motive remains the same. People still reach for the same promise: relief, peace, silence. The substance changes, the need does not. Every overdose, every law, Every headline is just another verse in the same unfinished hymn, the search for comfort that doesn't destroy the seeker. Science, to its credit, now works on both sides of that hymn, one lab designing escape, another designing rescue. Fentanyl may have outpaced policy, but it also forced the world to reconsider the question it has avoided for centuries. Not how to stop drugs, but how to stop suffering. You can tell a lot about a civilization by the size of its miracles. Some build cathedrals, some build rockets, and some, after a century of loss, build a small plastic bottle that fits in your palm and teaches the lungs how to breathe again. Naloxone was first synthesized in the 1960s, just another lab curiosity at the time. Chemists designed it as an antagonist, a substance that could nudge the brain's opioid locks and gently close them when they'd been held open too long. In plain language, it doesn't destroy the drug. It simply steps between the chemical and the receptor, like someone calmly removing a hand from a door handle. For decades, the medicine sat quietly in emergency rooms, used by anesthesiologists to wake patients after surgery. But as overdoses grew, first heroin, then OxyContin, then fentanyl, this humble compound found a new calling. By the 2010s, it had become the smallest and most democratic invention in the long, chaotic history of addiction. Naloxone doesn't moralize. It doesn't ask who you are or why you stopped breathing. It doesn't care whether your collapse happened in a penthouse or an alley. It just works. One spray in the nostril, or one quick injection into a thigh, and within seconds the brain's receptors release their chemical captors. The chest rises, air floods in, colour returns. For a few stunned moments, silence becomes breathing again. What happens next is not always graceful. The revived person often wakes disoriented, sometimes angry, confused, or in pain. The euphoria is gone, replaced by the rawness of reality. But they are alive, and that alone is the measure of success. If heroin and fentanyl represent humanity's arrogance, our desire to control pain absolutely, then naloxone represents humility. It's chemistry that admits its own mistakes and tries to correct them. A kind of molecular apology. Police officers now carry it in their belts. School nurses keep it in drawers. Parents hide it in glove compartments, hoping they'll never need it. Strangers on buses learn how to use it from small posters that read, "You can save a life in under a minute." It has turned ordinary people into emergency responders and emergencies into second chances. One of the quietest revolutions of this century is that more lives have been saved by naloxone than by any other single policy, treaty or speech in the war on drugs. And yet it is never called heroic. It's too humble for that word. The irony is soft but striking. The smallest bottle on the shelf may be the most compassionate thing science has ever made. For the chemists, the mechanism is elegant. The drug moves through the bloodstream faster than the opioids it replaces, racing ahead like an intercepting messenger. It finds the same receptors, the same molecular locks in the brain, and closes them with precision. There's no violence, no burning, no neutralization. Just a quiet switch, a reversal, and the invitation to start breathing again. For the rest of us, it feels like something simpler. A second chance wrapped in plastic. You can picture it. A stranger kneeling beside someone on the pavement, their voice shaking as they press the nozzle of a small orange spray into a nostril. "Come on," they whisper. "Breathe." And the miracle, that stubbornly biological miracle, happens. The chest moves, the air returns, life resumes its fragile contract. The act itself carries a strange kind of grace. It's mercy without permission. In those seconds, no one asks if the person deserved to be saved. They just are. Public health programs now distribute naloxone freely, handing it out at libraries, shelters, even concerts. Its presence has begun to change the shape of the epidemic. Where heroin once ended conversations, naloxone begins them. Families who had stopped talking start again. Communities that once hid their users now train each other to save them. Compassion, it turns out, spreads faster than policy. Of course, the debates persist. Some argue that easy access to naloxone encourages use, as if people overdose for the pleasure of revival. But data and reality disagree. In places where naloxone is widely available, deaths fall. Ambulance calls drop. The evidence is quiet but undeniable. Kindness works. What naloxone doesn't do is cure addiction. It's not designed for that. It doesn't erase craving or rewrite history. It simply buys time. One breath, one heartbeat, one chance at the next sunrise. But time, as it turns out, is the most powerful medicine of all. There's a certain poetry in its design. No batteries, no screens, no instructions longer than a sentence, just a spray, a breath, and hope. The first time someone sees it work, they never forget the sound. A sudden gasp followed by coughing, then the weak, impossible sound of a pulse returning. It's the sound of defiance against entropy itself. In another century, society would have built monuments for that kind of miracle. Today it's handed out in cardboard boxes, but maybe that's fitting. It's a monument that fits in your pocket. Portable mercy. Some paramedics describe it as pulling people back from the edge. Others say it feels like pressing rewind on a death they were seconds from witnessing. For all its chemistry, naloxone is ultimately a story about human stubbornness. Our refusal to let a mistake stay fatal. And perhaps that's the quiet victory of our age. After a century of trying to banish pain, we've learned finally how to protect those who fall victim to our own inventions. Naloxone doesn't end the story of heroin or fentanyl, but it changes the tone. It reminds us that if addiction reveals what's broken in society, then reversal reveals what's still humane. A small bottle, a short breath, a long silence. That's all it takes to remind the body that it's still capable of living. You would think that after centuries of experimenting with punishment, humanity might try comfort instead. It took a long time, but it happened. One quiet building at a time. The first supervised consumption site opened its doors in Europe in the 1980s. The name sounded bureaucratic, but the idea was radical. Give people a clean, monitored space to use their drugs, and fewer of them will die. It wasn't about approval, it was about survival. Inside these rooms, the air smells faintly of antiseptic and coffee. There are stainless steel tables, medical bins, and staff who speak softly. People arrive with small bags, sometimes trembling, sometimes calm. They sign in, they sit down, and they prepare their doses with sterile equipment provided for free. A nurse stands nearby, not to interfere, not to judge, but to be there if breathing stops. In most places, that moment would end with a siren. Here, it ends with a pulse. At first, the idea shocked people. Critics asked, why would you let someone inject poison under supervision? The answer was simple, because they already were, and pretending they weren't hadn't worked. Overdose deaths had become so common that emergency rooms couldn't keep up. These sites offered a different equation, one that replaced moral panic with simple math. Fewer infections, fewer ambulances, fewer funerals. The science followed. Studies from Vancouver, Sydney, and several European cities found that within a few hundred meters of a supervised site, overdose deaths dropped by roughly a third. That's not theory, that's geography. The closer you are to compassion, the longer you live. There's a strange stillness in these rooms. You can hear the small sounds that addiction usually hides. The rattle of a spoon, the tap of a lighter, the sigh of someone realizing they're still here. Staff move like librarians, careful not to disturb concentration. They know the ritual. They've seen it thousands of times. Every now and then, someone slumps forward. The nurse steps in, checks a pulse, administers a small spray of naloxone and waits. The body stirs, colour returns. No applause, no drama. Just another life quietly added back to the count. For all the outrage they attract, these sites are surprisingly ordinary. The walls are pale, the lighting soft. There are pamphlets on the counter about housing, healthcare and counselling. Some visitors stay only a few minutes. Others linger to talk. The conversations are rarely about drugs. They're about the weather, football, recipes, children. It turns out that when you remove the fear of dying, people remember they still have lives. To the outside world, the idea still feels backwards. But so did hand washing once. Harm reduction is like that. Common sense that has to survive its own controversy. There's a kind of humour in the official language governments use to describe these places. Consumption facilities, drug use rooms, supervised injection services. Bureaucratic poetry for rooms that do something ancient and simple. They keep watch. In medieval monasteries, monks would sit by the bedsides of the dying, whispering prayers to ease their passing. In modern cities, health workers do the same thing, except they whisper, "You're okay, just breathe." People sometimes imagine these sites as dens of chaos. They are not. They're remarkably calm. The walls absorb despair and return it as patience. The visitors know it's not paradise. It's a pause. A few hours where they're treated as people instead of problems. And sometimes something strange happens. People who survive an overdose in these rooms often come back, not to use again, but to talk, to ask about treatment programs, to ask about family, to ask what better looks like. It turns out that the first step toward recovery is rarely punishment. It's safety. The body can't heal when it's terrified. The data continues to pile up, but data rarely wins arguments. Morality likes to shout. Evidence prefers to whisper. Critics still insist these rooms enable addiction. Supporters answer that they enable breathing, which seems more urgent. The irony is unmistakable. The safest place to overdose is the only one where it's allowed. For the staff, the work is quiet but relentless. They see more reversals than celebrations, more near misses than miracles. Yet many describe it as sacred, not religious but deeply human. They aren't saving souls, they're buying time for them to decide whether they still want saving. Each overdose prevented is invisible to the world outside. There's no headline for "someone didn't die today." But inside these rooms, the absence of tragedy is the daily miracle. Every sigh, every breath restored, is a small victory against despair. If you listen, you can hear the rhythm, the soft clatter of metal, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the faint music from someone's headphones. The smell of sanitizer mixes with coffee and soap. It's the smell of harm reduction. Not glamorous, not sentimental, just clean. Some visitors bring flowers on the anniversaries of friends who didn't make it. They place them on the counter next to the sharps container. Life and death sitting side by side as they always have. And maybe that's the quiet genius of these places. They don't promise transformation. They promise continuity. They keep people alive long enough for choice to matter again. When you think about it, this might be the most realistic form of hope humanity has ever invented. Hope that begins by refusing to look away. The war on drugs built walls. Harm reduction builds rooms. Inside those rooms, history pauses for a moment, catches its breath, and learns to listen. Most stories about medicine end with triumph. The doctor holds up a vial, the music swells, and the patient smiles. But addiction medicine doesn't work that way. Its victories are quiet, repetitive, and slightly boring, which might be the point. The miracle now comes not in flashes of inspiration, but in the slow rhythm of ordinary survival. The heroes of this part of the story are two substances that will never appear in advertisements or perfume bottles: methadone and buprenorphine. They don't sparkle, they don't seduce, and they don't promise transformation. They simply keep people alive. They are in every sense the anti-heroic drugs. Methadone arrived first during World War II, when German chemists were looking for a synthetic painkiller that could replace morphine. It worked, though not exactly as expected. It had a long, slow effect, lingering in the bloodstream like a patient friend. Instead of the sudden rush that heroin provides, the fast key turning all the locks of the brain at once, methadone only half turns the mechanism. It gives enough relief to silence the screaming of withdrawal, but not enough to start the chorus of euphoria. Buprenorphine came later, more refined and slightly gentler. It fits into the brain's receptors the way a safety key fits a lock. It opens it only part way, never all the way. Imagine the brain as a hallway full of doors marked pain, fear, and peace. Heroin kicks them open. Methadone knocks politely and stays for tea. Buprenorphine simply cracks the door to let the air flow. Together, these medications became the backbone of what's now called medication-assisted treatment, though the term feels too mechanical for what it actually is. What it means, in human terms, is stability. A life that isn't ruled by the chase for the next dose. People take their measured portion each morning, often in a clinic, sometimes under supervision, sometimes at home. It's not glamorous, but neither is breathing. The first dose of methadone feels strangely unremarkable. There's no rush, no sparkle, no high, just a quiet easing, like a hand unclenching. For many, that calm is almost alien. After years of chaos, boredom becomes salvation. A patient once told a researcher, "It's not happiness, it's quiet, and quiet is new." Clinics have their own atmosphere, not the sterile brightness of hospitals, but the dull hum of daily maintenance. You can hear the shuffle of shoes, the murmured greetings, the clink of plastic cups being handed over the counter. Staff check records, nod hello, move to the next name. Outside, life continues, work, errands, buses. Inside, it's a small island of control. The critics, as always, complain that methadone and buprenorphine merely replace one addiction with another. The reality is more subtle. Dependence and addiction are cousins, not twins. Addiction is chaos. Dependence is routine. The first destroys, the second sustains. If you need proof, look at the overdose rates. They drop dramatically for people in treatment. Mortality falls by more than half. The evidence isn't emotional, it's statistical mercy. The medications don't erase the craving, but they dull it. They give space for therapy, work, and the long process of rebuilding. They don't promise freedom, they promise breathing room, and sometimes that's enough. Stigma, however, dies slower than heroin. Many clinics face protests. Some communities see them as eyesores, magnets for those people. Yet what happens inside those doors is the opposite of decay. It's the methodical reassembly of human life. People showing up, keeping appointments, learning how to stay steady. The waiting rooms, filled with tired faces and half-read magazines, are proof that progress doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. In the United Kingdom, where medical heroin, called diamorphine, is still used in rare supervised programs, some long-term users receive small controlled doses of the very drug that once controlled them. It sounds paradoxical. Heroin as treatment for heroin. But the logic is ancient. Fight fire with a candle, not a blaze. Under medical supervision, these patients regain stability. Employment rises, crime drops, health improves. It's not glamorous, but it works. Britain never fully abandoned diamorphine. They simply demoted it from hero to humble worker. The results are quietly impressive. When compassion meets control, chaos tends to leave. Every culture has its own version of this compromise. Some countries use methadone vans that visit rural areas. Others dispense buprenorphine through pharmacies. Some programs let patients take doses home, trusting them with responsibility. Others still insist on daily supervision. The difference doesn't lie in chemistry, but in philosophy. Do we trust people to recover or only to relapse? The irony is clear. After 100 years of chasing purity, of banning one drug after another, the most effective treatment turns out to be another opioid. A careful echo of the problem becomes the answer. It's the pharmacological equivalent of admitting that mistakes can be managed, not erased. In many ways, methadone clinics are the truest reflection of modern medicine's maturity. They aren't triumphant, they're administrative. Progress arrives dressed in paperwork and routine. But inside that monotony hides a small revolution. People surviving quietly, without needing to vanish to do it. The drugs themselves are not romantic. They come in amber, bottles labelled with barcodes and warnings. Their chemistry is simple, their purpose singular, but their effect, measured in mornings woken up to, in meals eaten, in jobs kept, is extraordinary. Imagine a world where success isn't defined by elimination, but by endurance. That's what these medicines represent. Not the end of addiction, but the end of despair. When you visit a clinic, you don't hear music or speeches. You hear sighs, pens scratching forms, the faint clatter of cups. Yet those sounds might be the real symphony of recovery. Not triumphant, but sustainable. After centuries of panic, punishment, and premature euphoria, medicine has learned to lower its voice. The best cure doesn't call itself heroic because it knows better. It shows up every morning, pours the dose, and keeps people alive. And that might be the most heroic act of all. By the time the 21st century settled into its second decade, something remarkable happened. The war on drugs, that century-long campaign of raids, rhetoric, and regret, began to sound tired, like an old soldier mumbling slogans no one believed anymore. Around the world, a few small countries started to ask a radical question. What if punishment had been the wrong medicine all along? Portugal asked it first. In 2001, faced with one of Europe's highest rates of heroin use and HIV infection, the government decided to try something different. It didn't legalise drugs exactly. It decriminalised them, a quiet but powerful shift in grammar. Possession for personal use would no longer send you to court, it would send you to a conversation. That conversation happened at what they called Commissions for the Dissuasion of Drug Addiction. The name was wonderfully bureaucratic, but the idea was human. Each panel included a doctor, a lawyer, and a social worker. When someone was caught with a small amount of drugs, they sat down with these three people, who didn't scold or arrest them. They asked questions. Are you okay? Do you want help? What's happening in your life? Sometimes the person agreed to treatment, sometimes they didn't. Either way, the process treated them as a citizen, not a case number. It sounded naive to the rest of the world, but 20 years later, Portugal's overdose rate is among the lowest in Europe. HIV transmission from shared needles plummeted. Most strikingly, addiction itself stopped being a headline. It became just another part of public health, mundane, managed, no longer moralised. The shift was cultural as much as legal. Instead of talking about addicts, Portugal started talking about people who use drugs. The difference looks small on paper, but feels enormous in the mouth. One word removes the person, the other puts them back. Language, at last, began to heal what stigma had broken. Elsewhere, the idea spread in fragments. In Canada, cities opened more supervised consumption sites. In CISA, Switzerland, heroin-assisted treatment became routine, even boring. In Australia, outreach vans carried sterile supplies and friendly advice. Each place found its own balance between law and mercy, between caution and care. The results were almost always the same: fewer deaths, fewer infections, more conversations. In the United States, the change came more slowly. Decades of political theatre had made harm reduction sound like surrender. But as overdose deaths reached historic levels, even the most cautious policymakers began to whisper what was once unspeakable. Survival is success, not perfection, not abstinence, just staying alive long enough for something better to happen. It's strange how small the instruments of this quiet revolution are. A nasal spray, a clean needle, a plastic cup of methadone. none of them dramatic, none of them cinematic, yet together they mark the first time in history that humanity stopped trying to win the war and started trying to stop the dying. You can feel this change in the language of those who work on the front lines. Paramedics now talk about reversals instead of saves. Social workers talk about stability instead of recovery. Even the word user has softened, taking on less accusation and more acknowledgement. Somewhere between compassion and exhaustion, the world began to understand that moral purity is a poor substitute for human life. Of course, harm reduction is not a solution, it's a truce, a recognition that the human need for relief will always outpace our systems of control. But in that truce, something beautiful survives: empathy. Every syringe exchanged, every overdose reversed, every clinic opened. These are not victories in the old sense. They're proofs of care, small acts that say, "We're not giving up on you yet." If you walk through Lisbon today, you'll see outreach workers talking softly with people in parks, offering coffee, counselling, or just a few minutes of dignity. You'll notice that the city feels normal, not utopian. There are still struggles, still relapse, still loss, but the absence of fear changes the texture of the air. It smells less like panic, more like rain on stone, the scent of a society learning patience. In this new landscape, the measure of progress isn't how many people quit drugs, it's how many live long enough to decide if they want to. Even language itself is adapting. Addiction treatment has become recovery support. Drug abuser has become person at risk. It's not political correctness, it's precision. Pain is not a crime, and empathy is not weakness. The great irony is that, after all this time, the world is returning to the simplest truth it forgot during its crusades. Chemistry is neutral, people are not. A molecule cannot be evil or holy. It can only do what it was designed to do. The rest is interpretation. And interpretation is where compassion begins. Somewhere, tonight, a nurse is refilling a methadone cup. A volunteer is handing out clean syringes. A parent is tucking a small box of naloxone into a coat pocket just in case. None of them will be on the news, but somewhere, someone will wake up tomorrow because of them. That's what survival looks like now. Not grand, not triumphant, just persistent. Humanity, after centuries of chasing perfection, is learning to accept progress in breaths instead of milestones. Heroin never stopped being chemistry. It just stopped being misunderstood. And maybe that's enough. We didn't conquer it. We learned to live around it, to build systems of care instead of cages, to build policies that forgive the body's longing for peace. The poppy still grows, the laboratories still hum, the cravings, the cures, the contradictions all continue. But among them now stands a quieter force, a belief that saving one life at a time, however imperfectly, is the only kind of victory that lasts. So the story ends not with redemption, but with responsibility. The war is over, the compassion remains. And somewhere in the background, beneath the noise of policy and politics, you can still hear the softest sound of all, a single person breathing again.